Hello and welcome to another A-Level History Revision tutorial by the Hapless Historian. In this tutorial we will be exploring the AQA A-Level paper 7042/1C, the Tudors 1485 to 1603, and this first revision tutorial is entitled Henry VII and Exam Techniques, Extracts Questions. In this tutorial, we will explore how to answer extracts questions from Section A of the A-Level History paper. So without further ado, let's get into it. But just before we move on, if you like the content of this revision tutorial, please don't forget to click the like and subscribe button. The aims of this tutorial are to explore the skills and techniques for addressing an extracts question on Henry VII in the A-Level History exam, to identify the skills and knowledge to evidence assessment objective A03, to demonstrate the skills and techniques for completing the extracts question in the allotted time in the exam. Understanding the format of the exam question is not literally its structure, but its underpinning ethos. The emphasis in a breadth course covers an overview of approximately 100 years, which explores change and continuity through time, in this case the Tudor dynasty from 1485 to 1603, unlike your depth courses which cover a specific issue in depth, like the Reformation, for example. What does this mean for the A-Level History student on a breadth course studying the period? It means an awful lot of reading of textbooks and reference books so that you are familiar with the key specialists in the given historical areas and their key arguments. The format of the extracts question is always the same, as follows. Using your understanding of the historical context, assess how convincing the arguments in these three extracts are in relation to. The reason I have highlighted the word three is because frequently on the AQA A-Level History paper on the Tudors, one of the extracts is not reproduced because of copyright infringement. Sometimes this is not necessarily an insurmountable problem because the paper sometimes gives at least the name of the historian. And today we're going to look at this problem in the tutorial in the case of S.B. Grimes. However, on other occasions, no information has been given whatsoever. So all you, the student, can do in those situations is to say, due to copyright infringements, the extract has not been reproduced, so I am unable to make an assessment. And that's all you have to put. I have spoken to or written to AQA exam board to ask why in the marking grid are there marks awarded for the extract when there's no information for the students to base an assessment on, and I'm awaiting a reply. It might be worth having a word with your teachers in the run-up to the exam to see what they suggest, but all I would suggest is that you can't comment on an extract you haven't got, especially if they give you no information at all. As well as revising the assessment objectives off by heart for your A-Level History exam, you need to be able to unpack it. When doing an extracts question, the target is A03, which requires you to analyse and evaluate in relation to the historical context different ways in which aspects of the past have been interpreted. Now, analyse means to demonstrate critical analysis. Evaluate means to evaluate history style, which means to reach an informed judgment about the value of your source to your historical topic. So what is historical evaluation? The ability to evaluate an historical source is central to being a good history student. Evaluation is the ability to reach an informed judgment about the source in relation to your historical topic. Evaluation answers key questions like how useful, how accurate, and how reliable is the source. A successful historical evaluation embraces competing views and arguments and then makes a supported judgment about the source that is supported by other historical evidence. A good way to learn to evaluate the arguments of historians is to read widely the work of professional historians, and this will enhance your critical thinking skills because each historian will advance an argument based on their own research. In terms of the key elements in evaluating a piece of historical writing, we are indebted to Professor Sari Waller of the Oxford Education blog. She advises the following ways to approach the subject. Begin by identifying the author's viewpoint. Ask, what is the overall argument in relation to the topic being studied? And again we come back to wide reading, because to answer this question you must be familiar with the work of the given historian and have read a substantial chunk of writing from your A-level history syllabus, including the reference books. Be on the lookout for views within views, or what historians call sub-arguments, a smaller argument used to support the main argument. These two need thinking about, but not until you have understood and evaluated the overall substantive or main argument. I'm trying to think of an example here, and I could think about the controversy over the character of Anne Boleyn amongst historians. Some paint her as a Jezebel and an ambitious, scheming woman, while others think she was genuinely a good woman who believed passionately in the cause of Protestantism and was trying to do the right thing. Now, the sub-argument of some historians who paint her as a Jezebel and a scheming woman cite the poems and music and letters that Smeaton, her musician, wrote to her, and Anne responded. Now that could be the argument within the main argument to support the view that she was an ambitious, scheming and faithless wife to Henry VIII. In terms of evaluating a piece of historical writing, form an opinion on the historian's argument by comparing it with what you already know about the topic, and there are plenty of other resources and sources to explore for arguments. Question the historian's arguments by examining whether the main premises are supported by factual historical evidence, and judge critically what you are reading by applying your own contextual historical knowledge drawn from your A-level history syllabus. And finally, a good history student should be able to make a supportive judgment about the persuasiveness of the passage of historical writing. So how do you, the student, demonstrate critical analysis at A-level? Critical analysis at A-level is evidenced by identifying the strengths and weaknesses of the interpretations presented, evaluating using the skills identified in the previous slide, and by presenting your own arguments as to how persuasive the argument or arguments in the extracts are by providing corroborating or alternative historical evidence. By providing a clear analysis of the issue at the end of each paragraph. This could be done simply by identifying the historical significance of the issue at the given time, by providing a judgment on the question with little or any narrative. Often there is a tendency for students to regurgitate quotes or chunks from the extract and then explain what they mean. The danger of this is that you are losing focus on the question and getting further and further away from answering it, and thus your mark plummets from a level 5 or 4 down to a 3 or a 2 or even a 1. Critical analysis is also evidenced by providing an outstanding answer that will be analytical throughout, and that's done by retaining focus on what the question is asking you to do, and providing a critical analysis of each historical factor identified in the question. An outstanding answer will provide sustained analysis throughout, and I'm going to show you techniques for doing that in an essay in this revision tutorial. And finally, an outstanding answer will present a clear, relevant and coherent, and that means thematically coherent, argument. Ideally, all the blood, sweat and tears that you're investing in your A-level history studies is because you want to attain a level 5 grade. And to do that, we need to remind ourselves what that is required in the extracts question. To obtain a level 5 grade, your answer must display a very good understanding of the interpretations given in the extracts, and to do that you need to read widely. It evaluates the extracts thoroughly to provide a well-substantiated judgment as to the extent each extract is either convincing or unconvincing. It provides an answer that demonstrates a very good understanding of the historical context, and this can only be achieved by extensive reading of the syllabus texts, including reference books. Yes, everybody, I'm sorry to sound like a broken record, but the only way you can really nail the extracts question is having a broad knowledge which can only come from wide reading. To achieve a level 4 grade, which is the next best grade, which is 19 to 24 marks, your answer must display a good understanding. So we've got very good for level 5 and a good understanding at level 4 of the interpretations given in the extracts. You must render sufficient comment on the extracts to provide a supported conclusion as to the extent each extract is either convincing or unconvincing. You must provide an evaluation of the arguments which is mostly well supported and convincing. Often when they say mostly well supported, the student hasn't done sufficient reading, so is not quite there in bringing a range of evidence that is well supported. The answer demonstrates a good understanding of the historical context. So what do we mean by a substantiated judgment or a supported conclusion? On one level, it can be argued that a substantiated judgment will get you a level 5 grade and a supported conclusion will get you a level 4 grade, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. You are required to make a judgment about the extracts regarding the extent to which you think they are convincing or unconvincing by providing a substantiated judgment. This means a judgment backed up with very good historical evidence. A well-substantiated judgment means finishing your answer with a judgment that is well supported with historical evidence and, where relevant, reaches a complex conclusion that reflects a wide variety of evidence. One way of reaching a complex conclusion is to present an argument from one historian and then a counter-argument from another historian. In the Tudors, one of the popular debates is whether Henry VII employed more middle-class men in his government, and this is a hypothesis or argument put forward by John Guy. However, Loades and Elton say, no, Henry used different strokes for different folks, so in the regions it would have been a mixture of nobility and gentry. Certainly in the Privy Council he combined nobility, senior clergy and members of the gentry, and this is how you can do an argument and counter-argument, but we'll look at that when we come to look at the extracts. A supported conclusion means finishing your answer with a judgment that is backed up with some accurate historical evidence from the extracts and your knowledge of the period. This usually means that the students who have not read widely enough to provide some good evidence, but not very good evidence because there are gaps in the argument. So the arguments are good, but they're not very good to get to level 5 because the student has not read widely enough. Before you write anything down, begin by identifying the content words and the process words. The content words are the subject matter, what the question is about, and the process words are what you need to do with the question in order to obtain a level 5 grade ideally, or the next best thing, a level 4 grade. So let us look at the AQA June 2019 question paper, and it states, using your understanding of the historical context, assess how convincing the three extracts are in relation to Henry VII's methods of government. So the subject words are Henry VII's methods of government, those are your content words, and your process words, what you need to do with the question is to assess how convincing the three extracts are. So let us remind ourselves again what the question is. Using your understanding of the historical context, assess how convincing the arguments in these three extracts are in relation to Henry VII's methods of government. And you know the target you need to look at is to demonstrate the ability to analyse and evaluate in relation to the historical context different ways in which aspects of the past have been interpreted. If you don't get a chance to read widely the reference books before your A-level history exam, it's worth trawling the reference section and finding out which historians are frequently mentioned. And these three books come up repeatedly on extracts questions on this AQA 70421C paper. And you can find out much about these historians just by looking at Wikipedia or going on to Google Scholar. So let's just for a moment think a little bit about the background of these three historians, which you can find out from either the internet or the preface to their books. And this again comes back to Sally Waller saying, a good historian will evaluate by immersing themselves in the research of the given historians to get a sense of their viewpoint and arguments that they are presenting. So take for example Geoffrey Elton. He was born in 1921 and he died in 1994. He was a German refugee from Nazi Germany who came to Britain in the early 1940s, and he went on to study at London University, where he completed a PhD in Tudor history. His PhD thesis argued that Thomas Cromwell was the founder of modern bureaucratic Tudor government, and he went on to teach history at Cambridge University. Stanley Bertram Grimes was born in 1907 and died in 1984. He was the Professor of History at University College Cardiff, and he was a noted biographer of Henry VII. He wrote several books on the life and career of this particular Tudor monarch, and in the preface of his book, Henry VII, from which this extract comes, Grimes states clearly that the aim of this book is to critique the early 16th and 17th century historians' interpretations of the first Tudor monarch, particularly men like Polydore Vergil. And let's not forget that Polydore Vergil was commissioned by Henry VII to write a history of England. Or men like Francis Bacon, who Grimes argues tended to present a rose-tinted spectacle version of Henry VII's kingship. S.B. Grimes argues that this book is an attempt at a more balanced assessment of Henry VII's domestic and foreign policies, although it does illustrate that Henry VII was a forceful personality and a skillful statesman in his dealings with both his Privy Council and Parliament, and this is relevant to your understanding of how convincing each of the extracts are when you come to answer the question. John Guy was born in Australia in 1949, and he is an Australian-British historian who, unlike Elton and Grimes, is still alive. He was a Fellow of Clare College, Cambridge, and he later became a full professor there. His work is credited with making Tudor history accessible to 21st century A-level students, and he brings the historical figures to life in various books like Elizabeth, The Forgotten Years, or Queen of Scots, or A Daughter's Love, the latter, which is a book that explores the relationship between Sir Thomas More and his daughter Meg, or the children of Henry VII. Guy was a student at Cambridge and was taught by the historian G.R. Elton. However, Guy rejects Elton's thesis about the career of Thomas Cromwell, arguing for a more modern interpretation of Tudor government and administration, suggesting that there were other key innovators in the Tudor period, and he reassesses the Reformation under Henry VIII and the religious and administrative reforms under Elizabeth I. So immediately, just by exploring Wikipedia or reading the preface to these books, we get a real sense of each of these three historians' approaches to the Tudor period and their historical interpretations. So let us turn now, having looked at these three different historians and their research interests, to the actual extracts. The first extract, Extract A, is G.R. Elton's From England Under the Tudors. Henry VII was a strong and independent king, ready to assert the powers of the English crown. The centre of Henry VII's government was the king himself, assisted by those with whom he chose to surround himself, that is, his council. This included great nobles, great prelates, and great administrators. Generally speaking, Henry's councillors were office holders, but many of these offices were minor. Naturally, there were grades and distinctions amongst them, even up to a point signs of differences of responsibilities. The one qualification which embraced them all was that the king had chosen them. They were his men and did his will. It should be made plain once and for all that there was never more than one council in existence at the centre. There was only one body to which men called councillors could belong. The council's function was threefold. It existed to advise the king in matters of policy, to administer the realm, and to adjudicate on cases brought before it in petition. With regard to this extract, this is where all your hard work and reading and revision pays off, because in the June 2019 exam paper, this extract B, was not reprinted due to copyright infringement. However, if you look at the marking grid that the examiners use for this exam, there were still a lot of marks going because there was a question asking about Grimes's historical interpretation of Henry VII's methods of government, and I have reprinted it on the slide here. This extract is taken from page 135, the introduction to chapter 7 entitled Parliaments and Great Councils. Little or nothing of much significance occurred in the history of Parliament in the reign of Henry VII, or in other words, Parliament as an institution was not in any way notably different at the dissolution in 1504 of Henry's Parliament from what it had been at the meeting of its first Parliament in 1485. The precedents already set over the previous century also were followed. There were no significant innovations in procedure, so far as we know, no change in composition or electoral arrangements. Few legislative measures enacted were of any great importance. No change in the relations between the King's government or any part of Parliament occurred. The summonses of Parliament were infrequent, only 7 in the whole reign, and in the Assembly of 1504 the King expressly stated that he was not minded for the ease of his subjects to summon another for a long time without great and necessary and urgent causes. Throughout the 23 years and 8 months of the reign, Parliament sat for about 72 weeks in all, but great councils, Lords without Commons, were summoned 5 or 6 times, and the continued existence of these assemblies has to be borne in mind if the consultative activities of Henry's government are to be assessed. As you can see, being a 21st century historian, John Guy has a much easier and more accessible prose style than G.R. Elton and S.B. Grimes, and so it's easier to get straight to the point. The need in Henry VII's reign was less for new legislation than for the means to enforce existing law. Henry's most significant contribution to government was his shift towards direct reliance on lesser gentry as justices of the peace. The role of justices of the peace in local government was crucial to maintaining law and order. Henry VII needed to appoint local men with local knowledge, legal expertise and sufficient social standing to command authority. Henry sought to weaken the ties which traditionally linked the local interests of the nobility and gentry which resulted in the corruption of justice. To increase the Crown's control of law and order, he appointed justices of the peace who were middling gentry, including professional lawyers and even men who did not have property in a shire. By the end of his reign, Henry had not fully established his authority in the localities. However, justices of the peace had superseded the sheriff and the feudal lord as the Crown's administrative agents. When structuring your answer, first think about how much you can write legibly in 40 to 45 minutes. Most students can usually complete between 2.5 to 3 sides of A4. Next, a good way to structure our answer is as follows. Paragraph 1 is your opening paragraph, which should identify the focus of the question and how you're going to tackle it. Paragraph 2 identifies the main arguments from extract A. Paragraph 3 identifies the extent to which extract A's arguments are convincing or unconvincing. Paragraph 4 identifies the main arguments from extract B. Paragraph 5 identifies the extent to which extract B's arguments are convincing or unconvincing. Paragraph 6 identifies the main arguments from extract C. And paragraph 7 identifies the extent to which extract C's arguments are convincing or unconvincing. Now, sometimes it's suggested that you do them sequentially in terms of extract A, then extract B, and extract C in terms of main arguments, and then whether you find them convincing or unconvincing. But I just want you to draw your attention to the examiner's report of 2022, because it gives you some good pointers on what not to do. It states, and I quote, "Most students answered the extract question by examining the extract sequentially, and only a few considered them thematically." Now, I know that the major emphasis in this extracts question is for you to be able to evidence assessment objective A03, but when discussing the importance and the arguments, whether they're convincing or unconvincing, you will also mention A01 themes of cause, consequence, and historical significance. And it concludes, there was a tendency for students to launch into their responses and examine the extracts line by line, checking facts as they go. Some responses which were structured in this way did focus on the arguments, but there were unfortunately few of these. And what they're alluding to there, the examiner, is a loss of focus and a loss of critical analysis, which plummets your grade down to a 3, 2, or even 1. So bear this in mind, and this is why I have suggested this way of structuring your answer, which I hope you will find useful. If I was doing this question, my opening paragraph would look something like this. Remember, I've had a lot more practice than you because I'm a little bit older. But you could begin with something like, to analyse critically to what extent 3 extracts are convincing in an evaluation of Henry VII's methods of government, it is first necessary to locate the analysis in the context of Henry's accession. When Henry ascended the throne, few people believed he would be king for very long, or that the Wars of the Roses were over. Furthermore, Turvey points out that the Wars of the Roses have been triggered in part by the precedent set by Henry Bolingbroke when he usurped the throne, and which, according to Elton, 1991, sealed the decay of royal authority. Hence, royal control would come to rely increasingly on the skills and forceful personality of the individual monarch, and how he dealt with the problem of overmighty nobles, whose power had filled the power vacuum generated by a series of weak monarchs, with the exception of Henry V and Henry VII. Now, I've put some pointers here that I just want to go through with you. So, the writing in red, Henry VII's methods of government, in the first sentence, I've put here, by repeating elements of the question, you are showing the examiner that you understand the question. That's one of the criticisms that frequently comes up in the A-level examiner's report, that often students don't understand the question or lose focus. So if you repeat it in the first sentence, you're hitting them in the face that you understand the question from the get-go. And in terms of Turvey's point that the Wars of the Roses have been triggered in part by the precedent of Henry Bolingbroke usurping the throne, is spelling out to the examiner that you understand the relevance of key historical factors to an understanding of the quality of the extracts you're going to look at. And the precedent set by Henry Bolingbroke when he usurped the throne in the Wars of the Roses, by the time we get to Henry VII, we've had something like 4 usurpations in 40 years. And during that time, we see the decay of royal authority. So again, you are spelling out to the examiner themes of consequence and historical significance. And this is what we mean. One of the ways of demonstrating critical analysis at the end of each paragraph is to remind the examiner of the historical significance of these factors. What happened with the decline or decay of royal authority is that overmighty nobles filled the power vacuum. And I go on to say, hence royal control would come to rely increasingly on the skills and forceful personality of the individual monarch and how he dealt with the problem of overmighty nobles whose power had filled the power vacuum generated by a series of weak monarchs, with the exception of Henry V and Henry VII. Now you could look at this just to get some ideas, and you could always put this into your own words. It's not going to be a problem. I've probably done it a bit too complicated, but I'm sure your way of writing is much better than mine. But it's just to give you a short, punchy paragraph which draws together your presentation of the arguments and demonstrates your critical analytical skills, A-level history style. Owing to the time, you get straight into answering the question and you present the main arguments from Elton in your answer, because this is a test to see if you understand what these arguments are, so you can analyse them critically. Elton's main contention is that Henry was the centre of government because he was in control of both its membership through the men he selected and in control of its role. Furthermore, Henry VII was a forceful and independent king, and the council represented his administrative body, which was controlled by Henry and which essentially did his bidding. In this respect, Elton offers a bureaucratic interpretation of the council, which had a clearly defined role and function. Elton asserts Henry carefully selected members drawn from the nobility and the senior clergy and the rising gentry, and specifically chose administrators for their administrative and judicial abilities. Elton contends that the council had 3 main functions, which were 1. To advise the king, 2. Administration of the kingdom, and 3. Adjudication in Henry's courts. Elton is convincing in arguing that Henry had a personal style of government that was aloof from his councillors, but this was also, to some extent, a consequence of his time in exile, where he had to be vigilant against plots either to assassinate or capture him. It is true that he did not have a close relationship with the political nation in England, as Kathy Lee 2008 calls it, especially the nobility. This aloofness also enhanced the mysticism and authority of kingship, which had taken a serious dent during the Wars of the Roses and helped to prevent factionalism within the council, which became a feature of Henry VIII's Privy Council. Elton is persuasive in arguing that Henry VII chose his ministers from the nobility, for example Daubeny and Dynham, and churchmen such as Morton and Fox, as well as gentry lawyers Reginald Bray and Richard Empson, because of their administrative skill. Elton can be challenged in his assertion that Henry's choice was dictated by his wariness of overmighty nobles. His decisive victory at the Battle of Bosworth, together with the series of deaths in the 1490s in key magnate families, meant the houses of Warwick, Northumberland and Buckingham were now headed by wards of the Crown. It is true that Henry VII relied on the nobility in the Yorkshire Rebellion in 1489 and in the Cornish Rebellion in 1497, but these were all men that owed their position to Henry, for example, the Earl of Surrey, who quashed the Yorkshire Rebellion, and the Duke of Bedford, who quashed the Cornish Rebellion. Elton is convincing in arguing that the council had three main functions: to advise the king, to administer the kingdom, and to make legal judgments, but there is little evidence that there were established rules and procedures in the functioning of the Privy Council. Elton is partly convincing that the council was key to Henry's government, but he also drew upon advice of family and friends, including his mother Margaret Beaufort, his uncle Jasper Tudor, and his good friend John de Vere. For instance, Lee, writing in 2008, describes Henry stopping at St Albans on the way to his coronation in September 1485 to plan with these friends and family whom Henry would appoint to his Privy Council. The purpose of Henry's council was to ensure the government of the country, as Elton maintains, but it was primarily to do Henry's will, and in the management of the Council of Learned in the Law, Henry adopted a pragmatic approach to the collection of feudal dues, while its collection of bonds and recognizances was often used to entrap subjects into paying forced loans and fines for good behaviour, especially after 1504. Grimes argues that Parliament was of little significance. It met infrequently and on only 7 occasions, when its primary function was to provide the king with extraordinary finance. Grimes asserts that few of the statutes that emerged from Henry's parliaments can be regarded of major importance. Grimes argues that Henry could not do without Parliament, particularly the financial grants made, and each of the 7 parliaments made some form of financial contribution to the Crown. Grimes argues that the Acts of Parliaments were key to enable Henry VII to establish his authority, for example, various Acts of Attainder and the Act of Resumption of 1485. Now it sounds here like Grimes is contradicting himself, so we need to see if his arguments are a bit more nuanced, which we will come to in a moment. Grimes is convincing regarding the way in which Henry controlled Parliament. There is evidence which suggests that he only convened Parliament 7 times in 23 years, and he prorogued or dissolved it quickly once it had introduced the legislation he wanted. For example, the 7th of November Parliament of 1485 was dissolved on the 10th of December 1485. Grimes is convincing in his argument that Parliament was significant in Henry VII establishing his right to rule. In addition to the 1485 Act of Resumption, Parliament reintroduced a 1397 Act of Henry IV's declaring the legitimacy of the Beaufort line, which was vital in securing Henry's right to the throne. Grimes is, however, unconvincing in his argument that these various pieces of legislation, such as Acts of Attainder, secured Henry's rule and controlled the nobility. Henry VII was still very dependent on feudal methods of control, particularly in the regions far away from London, such as in the north, where he relied heavily on the nobility and their alliance with the gentry to maintain law and order. Guy argues that the overarching priority for Henry's government was to establish law and order. He asserts that the key strategy for achieving this was to use the gentry to undermine the power of the nobility within the council and in the localities. Guy argues that central to Henry's policies was the promotion of the post of Justices of the Peace, or JPs. Henry increased the power of JPs at the expense of sheriffs, who were mainly drawn from the nobility, while JPs were drawn mainly from the gentry, and many were trained lawyers. Guy argues that Henry attempted to break the relationship which linked the nobility and gentry as a way to increase law and order and to prevent the corruption of justice. Guy asserts that by the end of his reign, although Henry had not fully imposed his authority in all localities, he had successfully replaced sheriffs and feudal lords with JPs, as the main administrative agents in the regions. Guy is convincing that Henry sought to bring an end to lawlessness, which had been a feature of the Wars of the Roses and which was based on the power of overmighty nobles. Guy is also convincing in his argument that during Henry VII's reign, 21 new statutes were passed, increasing the power of JPs, including the power to appoint jurors, vet juries, and power to impose bonds on the members of the nobility, including sheriffs. Guy is convincing in asserting that Henry tried to use justices of the peace to break the affinity between the nobility and gentry. However, other methods were more successful in achieving this, for example the Acts Against Illegal Retaining, which also prevented the gentry from retaining men-at-arms. Guy is unconvincing in stressing the administrative role of JPs. Local ties were too well established and many gentry JPs were unwilling to challenge directly members of the nobility in their counties, particularly at the height of the Cornish and Yorkshire rebellions. This failure to challenge the nobility contributed to Henry's failure to establish his authority formally. It is important to note that Henry did not rely primarily on JPs to control the nobility. The use of bonds and recognizances was a much more effective way of establishing the authority of the crown. Guy is unconvincing in arguing that Henry sought to bypass the nobility by promoting men from the gentry. Ferriby et al., writing in 2017, argued Henry used different approaches for different parts of the country, hence his councils were made up of a mixture of nobility, clergy and gentry, but when he needed to establish law and order, such as in Wales, he established a Council of Wales under his uncle the Duke of Bedford, and he staffed it with members of the Welsh nobility, many of whom owed their positions to Henry. Also, Henry was able to crush the Yorkshire Rebellion by appointing the Earl of Surrey as his lieutenant in the north, in command of the Royal Army. That concludes this A-level revision tutorial presentation on how to answer extracts questions on Henry VII. Well done for making it to the end. I do hope that you have found it useful in terms of how to evidence Assessment Objective 3 and how to demonstrate critical, analytical and evaluation skills in the exam, and how to structure your answer and complete it in the time allotted. If you have found this tutorial useful, don't forget to look out for other tutorials by the Hapless Historian, including extracts questions on Henry VIII, the Little Tudors, Edward VI and Mary I, and Elizabeth I, and also some revision tutorials on how to answer essay questions in the exam. And if you found it useful, please don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button. This is the Hapless Historian signing off.